My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. She said her mother and her new husband would be there. She said they were trying to make him feel like family. So I spent Christmas Eve my own way. But just after midnight, my daughter called. Her voice was shaking. She asked me why I was on the news. I am Javon Wright. I am 70 years old. I laid bricks in the freezing rain to build a commercial real estate empire. I gave my family everything. They repaid me with a knife in the back. But I did not bleed. I adjusted. Let me tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect illusion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Glenn feels intimidated by your presence, Dad, Kendra said through the phone. Her voice held that practiced corporate tone she used when firing contractors. He is trying to step into a fatherly role for Blake and me. Having you at the dinner table makes him insecure. You understand, right? I stood in the center of my silent living room. I bought the $2 million estate she was currently standing inside. I paid for the imported marble floors. I paid for the heated driveway. I paid for the designer furniture she flaunted to her friends. Now I was officially banned from the property so my former wife Vanessa and her new husband could play patriarch. Vanessa always hated my calloused hands. She preferred Glenn because he came from old money. Glenn was a man who financed his luxury cars with high-interest credit cards. He was a fraud. I did not yell. I did not call my daughter ungrateful. Anger is a luxury for people who lack control. I simply held the phone and breathed. I understand perfectly, Kendra, I replied. Enjoy your Christmas dinner. Thanks, Dad, she said quickly. She was relieved she did not have to deal with an emotional outburst. We will drop off some leftovers on Sunday. The line went dead. The silence in my house felt absolute. I put the phone in my pocket. I did not throw it. I did not pace the floor. I walked calmly toward the kitchen to make a pot of black coffee. The rejection stung, but it was expected. Kendra had been pushing me away for 2 years. She wanted the lifestyle my money provided, but she detested the man who provided it. I was just the rough-edged bricklayer who embarrassed her in front of her high society friends. A sudden sharp ache gripped the center of my chest. I stopped walking and placed my hand over my ribs. I closed my eyes and took a slow, measured breath until the pain subsided. It was a familiar warning. 8 months ago, a mild heart attack put me in a hospital bed for 2 weeks. The doctors told me to step back from the daily operations of my logistics and real estate firm. I listened to them. I handed the keys to my empire over to my son-in-law Blake. I trusted my family. I walked to the kitchen island and looked down at my hands. They were scarred, thick, and permanently calloused. I spent my 20s hauling concrete blocks and tying rebar. I spent my 30s negotiating cutthroat land deals. Every single dollar I made came from physical agony and relentless discipline. I compared my hands to the memory of Blake and his soft, manicured fingers. He wore designer watches and used financial buzzwords he learned at an expensive business school I paid for. He sneered at the warehouse workers. He despised the truck drivers. He thought wealth was something you manifested through networking events and flashy presentations. I thought handing him the reins would teach him true responsibility. I thought it would secure the financial future for Kendra and any children they might have. Instead, it gave an arrogant, over-leveraged day trader the keys to a kingdom he did not understand. I opened the kitchen cabinet and pulled out a fresh coffee filter. I needed caffeine. The chest pain completely vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I was 70 years old, but my mind was a steel trap. I stepped on the pedal of the stainless steel trash can to throw away the old coffee grounds. The lid popped open. Beneath an empty milk carton, I noticed a thick, heavy stock piece of paper crumpled into a tight ball. My house cleaner had emptied the bins yesterday afternoon. The only person who had visited my home since then was Blake. He dropped by 2 hours ago. He claimed he needed to borrow a bottle of vintage wine from my cellar for the Christmas party. I reached into the trash and pulled out the crumpled paper. It felt rigid like legal parchment. I placed it on the granite countertop and smoothed out the deep wrinkles with the palm of my hand. The bold red letters at the top of the page immediately caught my attention. It was a final notice of foreclosure. The header did not belong to a legitimate bank or a standard lending institution. It bore the crest of a shadow lending syndicate. I knew exactly who they were. They operated in the gray areas of corporate finance. They preyed on desperate businessmen who were too radioactive for traditional banks. They did not settle debts in civil court. They settled debts by seizing assets through violence and intimidation. Blake did not come to my house to borrow wine. He came to my house to hide a fatal mistake. He panicked and threw the notice in my kitchen trash. He assumed the cleaning lady would take it away before I woke up. He was always sloppy. He never paid attention to details. I read the details of the foreclosure notice. My blood ran completely cold. The property listed as collateral was the Southside Warehouse District. It was the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio. I bought those 40 acres of industrial land with cash over 3 decades. There was no mortgage on that property. It generated steady, massive revenue every single month. According to the document, the syndicate was claiming absolute ownership due to a defaulted loan of $5 million. I traced my finger down to the bottom of the page. There, resting on the signature line, was my name. It was a clumsy, frantic forgery. The loops were wrong. The pressure was entirely uneven. Blake had illegally leveraged a $40 million asset to cover his own catastrophic financial failures. He used my name to borrow money from violent criminals. The syndicate had given him a strict deadline. If the debt was not paid in full by December 26th, they would seize the warehouses by force. Blake was planning to sacrifice my life work to save his own skin. I folded the document and slid it into my jacket pocket. I turned away from the kitchen and walked straight down the hallway toward my private study. I needed to check my corporate succession documents. I needed to see exactly how much power Blake had managed to steal while I was recovering from my heart attack. I pushed aside the large oil painting hanging behind my desk. I revealed the biometric scanner of my hidden wall safe. The game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer a retired old man seeking peace. I was a businessman protecting his empire. I walked down the long hallway of my house and entered my private study. The room was dark and smelled of old leather and mahogany. I did not bother turning on the main lights. I knew exactly where I was going. I stepped behind the heavy oak desk and reached for the large oil painting hanging on the wall. It was a painting of the city skyline I helped build with my own hands. I pushed the heavy frame aside on its custom hinges. Behind it was a solid steel wall safe. I placed my right thumb against the biometric scanner. The machine beeped a quiet note of approval. The heavy metal door clicked and swung open. I reached inside, expecting to feel the familiar thick manila envelopes. I expected to find the original property deeds to the Southside Warehouse District. I expected to find my corporate succession plans and the legally binding trust documents I drafted 5 years ago to protect my empire. My hand met empty space. The steel shelf was entirely bare of my most important legal lifelines. Blake had not just rummaged through my trash. He had bypassed a secondary security protocol. I realized my daughter must have given him my backup access codes. Kendra was the only other living person who knew how to open this vault. The betrayal ran deeper than a greedy son-in-law. My own flesh and blood had sold me out. I traced my calloused fingers along the cold steel bottom of the safe. There was only one item left inside. It was a single manila folder laying flat in the dark. I pulled it out and carried it to my desk. I flicked on the small brass reading lamp. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the illuminated wood. The documents were printed on heavy stationery bearing the official crest of a private psychiatric clinic. I read the name at the top of the letterhead. It belonged to a high-end facility on the affluent side of the city. I had never stepped foot inside that building in my entire life. I scanned the first page. It was a comprehensive medical evaluation signed by a chief medical officer. The doctor claimed to have examined me personally on 3 separate occasions over the last month. The evaluation detailed a rapid and severe cognitive decline. According to this highly credentialed fraud, I was suffering from the late stages of severe dementia. The doctor wrote that I suffered from aggressive outbursts and acute memory loss. He stated I could no longer recognize my own family members or understand basic financial concepts. The bottom of the page bore his official medical license number and a bold signature. I flipped to the second document. The air in my lungs turned to ice. It was a medical power of attorney. This was not a simple draft. It was fully notarized and stamped with the official seal of the state circuit court. A corrupt judge had signed off on the petition. The document granted Blake absolute and total control over my medical and financial decisions. It stripped me of my legal autonomy. According to the state of affairs written on these pages, I was legally a ghost. Blake had weaponized the legal system to declare me a vegetable. He needed absolute control to leverage the $40 million warehouse district to his shadow lending syndicate. I stared at the court stamp. Blake was arrogant, but he was not a criminal mastermind. He did not have the discipline to orchestrate this level of complex fraud alone. He paid the doctor. He paid the judge. I used my money to buy the very weapons he was using to destroy me. He intended to lock me away in a care facility where no one would listen to the frantic claims of a senile old man. He would smile and play the tragic son-in-law while he sold my life work to the highest bidder. My phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. The sudden buzzing noise broke the heavy silence of the study. I picked up the device. The screen illuminated a new text message from Vanessa. My former wife always had a perfect instinct for cruel timing. I opened the message. "Javon, it is a shame you missed the Christmas Eve party because you are too frail," she wrote. "Kendra says your mind is slipping fast these days. You really should have come." Glenn bought a vintage champagne to celebrate. Blake just closed a massive new business deal that will set the family up for generations. You should be proud your son-in-law is finally taking your outdated company into the modern world. Get some rest, old man. I read the words twice. Vanessa was a shallow woman who worshipped money. She had no idea she was cheering for a man who had just leveraged her daughter's future to violent loan sharks. She thought Blake was a visionary genius. I deleted the message. I did not type a response. I did not waste my energy engaging with a fool. The entire picture snapped into brutal focus. Blake and Kendra were not just stealing the warehouse district, they were going to have me forcibly removed from my home. The fake medical evaluation was the foundation for an involuntary commitment order. Men in white coats would arrive at my door under the guise of an emergency health intervention. They would drag me to a locked psychiatric ward. I would be sedated and silenced before the sun came up on Christmas morning. I turned off the brass reading lamp. I folded the fraudulent documents and slid them into the inside pocket of my jacket. I walked to the front closet and grabbed my heavy wool winter coat. I bypassed the sleek European sedans sitting in my heated garage. Those cars represented luxury and comfort. I did not need comfort tonight. I needed reliability. I walked over to my original 1980 Ford work truck. The paint was chipped and the body was rusted, but the engine was a masterpiece I rebuilt with my own hands. I climbed into the cab and turned the key. The heavy engine roared to life with a fierce metallic growl. I slammed the gear shift into reverse and backed out into the freezing snowy night. I drove straight toward the downtown financial sector. I had to find Oliver. My corporate attorney was the only man ruthless enough to help me dismantle this conspiracy. The tires crunched against the fresh snow as I accelerated down the empty highway. The Shadow Syndicate would seize my properties on December 26th. Blake planned to finalize his overseas sale before the banks opened tomorrow. I gripped the steering wheel with my calloused hands. The clock was ticking and I had an empire to defend. I parked my truck illegally in front of the towering glass skyscraper that housed Oliver's law firm. The winter wind whipped through the empty downtown streets. I did not feel the cold. I rode the private elevator up to the 40th floor. The reception area was completely dark. I walked down the silent corridor toward the corner office. A single band of light spilled out from underneath the heavy wooden door. Oliver was always working. I pushed the door open without knocking. Oliver sat behind his massive mahogany desk surrounded by tall stacks of legal briefs. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked up and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He did not ask why I was there. He read the urgency in my posture. I walked straight to his desk and dropped the crumpled foreclosure notice and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation right on top of his open files. "Read these," I commanded. Oliver picked up the documents. His eyes scanned the heavy stock paper with clinical precision. I watched his jaw tighten. He was a man who had navigated corporate bloodbaths for 30 years. He knew a death warrant when he saw one. "This is a medical power of attorney signed by Judge Miller," Oliver said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "Miller is notoriously corrupt. Blake bought him off. The second document is a seizure notice from the Ironwood Syndicate. They are claiming absolute ownership of the Southside Warehouse District." I pulled out a leather chair and sat down heavily. "Blake has declared me legally insane," I told him. "He handed the keys to my empire to a gang of violent criminals. I need to know exactly how much damage he has done." Oliver did not waste time with questions. He swiveled his high-definition monitor toward me and began typing rapidly. His fingers pounded the keyboard with practiced speed. He bypassed the standard corporate firewalls and accessed the encrypted back-end ledgers. The screen flooded with endless rows of red numbers. The financial bleeding was catastrophic. Blake had treated my logistics company like his own personal casino. "Look at these transaction logs," Oliver said. He pointed a steady finger at the screen. "Blake diverted $5 million from the Operational Reserve Fund over the last 4 months. He dumped the money entirely into highly leveraged cryptocurrency trades. He thought he could outsmart the market algorithms. The market crushed him instead. The crypto bubble burst and completely wiped out the entire investment in a matter of days." Blake was staring at a lengthy federal prison sentence for corporate embezzlement. He panicked. Instead of coming to me for help, he went to the criminal underworld. Oliver pulled up a hidden shadow ledger buried deep within the accounting software. Blake took a desperate bridge loan from the Ironwood Syndicate to cover the missing $5 million before the quarterly corporate audit. The syndicate operates strictly outside the law. They do not require credit checks or corporate guarantees. They require hard physical collateral. Blake forged your signature and used the Southside Warehouse District to secure the debt. He handed over a $40 million asset for a $5 million lifeline. My chest tightened with cold, hard fury. The Southside District was the beating heart of my operation. Hundreds of my drivers relied on those dispatch hubs to feed their families. Blake had gambled away their livelihoods to protect his fragile ego. The syndicate does not take partial payments, Oliver explained grimly. They deal in absolute ownership. If a borrower defaults, they take the collateral by sheer force. They bring baseball bats and gasoline. They burn down businesses to collect insurance money if they cannot quickly sell the property. Blake invited arsonists into our house. He thought he could manage wolves. He was nothing but a sheep wearing a tailored suit. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor. Find the repayment schedule, I instructed. Oliver opened a deeply encrypted email thread between Blake and an unknown offshore server. He extracted a digital contract. The Ironwood Syndicate gave him a strict, unyielding deadline. The $5 million debt plus $2 million in exorbitant interest fees must be paid in full by December 26th. If the money is not wired by midnight, the warehouses belong to the mob forever. Today is Christmas Eve. We have less than 48 hours to stop a complete takeover. I watched Oliver pull up another hidden folder containing draft contracts. Blake is not planning to let the syndicate take the property, Oliver said. He opened a preliminary sales agreement. Blake has secretly arranged to sell the entire warehouse district to a predatory overseas developer. The developer is offering $25 million in pure cash. It is a massive, insulting undervaluation of the property, but it provides immediate liquid capital. Blake plans to execute the sale tomorrow morning on Christmas Day. He will pay off the violent syndicate and pocket the remaining $18 million for himself and Kendra. He will hide the stolen cash in untraceable offshore accounts. By the time the holidays are over, my legacy will be completely liquidated and stripped down to the studs. The sheer audacity of the plan was staggering. Blake was willing to destroy my life work on Christmas morning while smiling at my dinner table. He viewed my empire as a piggy bank to cover his catastrophic failures. We need to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately, Oliver said. He reached for the heavy desk phone. I can have a financial crimes unit raid his house before sunrise. Put the phone down, Oliver, I commanded. My voice left no room for debate. A federal investigation will lock the company assets in litigation for years. The union workers will lose their pensions while the lawyers argue in court. Furthermore, the Ironwood Syndicate will retaliate the moment they see flashing police lights. They will burn the warehouses to the ground out of spite just to send a message. I will not allow the government to freeze my empire. I will not allow criminals to destroy it. We are handling this in-house. Oliver slowly lowered the phone. He looked at me with a grim understanding. The medical power of attorney is court-sanctioned, Javon. Blake has absolute legal authority to sign that sales agreement tomorrow morning. You are legally incapacitated. How do you intend to stop a completely legal commercial transaction when you do not even exist on paper? I stared across the mahogany desk at Oliver. He was a brilliant lawyer, but he sometimes forgot who built the arena we were fighting in. I did not build my logistics company by trusting pieces of paper. I built it by anticipating thieves. I leaned forward and placed my calloused hands flat on his desk. I reminded him of the winter of 1995. A rival shipping conglomerate attempted a ruthless, hostile takeover while I was hospitalized with severe pneumonia. I survived the illness, and I crushed their buyout. The very next week, I forced Oliver to draft an ironclad corporate charter. We buried a specific poison pill clause deep within the foundational bylaws of the company. It dictated that any transfer or sale of core operational assets required my direct physical biometric verification at the central bank headquarters. A simple signature was intentionally insufficient to move the Southside warehouse district. A medical power of attorney could not bypass my thumbprint or my retinal scan. If an unauthorized party attempted to force a sale, the system was programmed to trigger an automatic and absolute lockdown of the entire corporate trust. The assets would freeze completely. No one could buy, sell, or leverage a single square foot of my property without triggering an immediate federal audit. I told Oliver to initiate the lockdown. Blake thought he held a royal flush with that fake dementia diagnosis. He did not realize the casino belonged to me. Oliver nodded sharply. He understood the mechanism immediately. He turned back to his high-definition monitors. His fingers moved across the keyboard with aggressive precision. He bypassed the standard corporate portals and accessed the direct encrypted link to the central bank. He typed in his senior counsel override credentials to manually activate the poison pill clause. A green loading bar appeared on the screen. We watched it crawl toward completion. I waited for the confirmation alert that would secure my empire. Suddenly, the screen flashed a brilliant, aggressive red. The system displayed a bold access denied notification. Oliver frowned. He typed in a secondary backdoor code we kept for absolute emergencies. The system rejected his credentials again. A medical power of attorney should not override a foundational biometric lock, Oliver muttered. He pulled up the raw firewall logs of the banking server. His eyes scanned the cascading lines of code. He found the breach. Someone inside the central bank had manually intercepted the security protocol. They used the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to classify my biometric requirement as medically impossible to fulfill due to severe cognitive decline. They essentially told the bank computer that I was a vegetable and could not physically provide a thumbprint. The system accepted the manual override. Blake was arrogant and reckless. He did not possess the technical knowledge or the security clearance to hack a centralized banking server on his own. He found someone on the inside with enough executive authority to approve the bypass. He used my stolen money to buy a mole. Find the digital footprint, I commanded. Every action within a federal bank leaves an employee identification tag. Oliver ran a decryption program on the unauthorized override signature. The red lines of code unraveled into plain English. The screen displayed an employee identification number and a name, Trent Harrison. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I knew Trent. I knew his father, Marcus Harrison. Marcus was one of my earliest and most loyal forklift mechanics. He died of a sudden aneurysm on the warehouse floor 20 years ago. Trent was just a teenager at the time. I stepped in because it was the right thing to do. I paid for the funeral expenses. I paid Trent's entire tuition at a premium business school to ensure the boy had a solid future. I wrote the personal recommendation letter that got him his first executive position at the central bank. The betrayal burned with a cold, fierce intensity. My own generosity had been weaponized against me. Blake lacked loyalty, so he simply purchased it. He found Trent and exploited the young man's greed. He offered Trent a massive slice of my stolen empire. Trent sold out the man who gave him a career to help a fraudster tear down my legacy. I did not shout his name in anger. I did not smash my fists against the desk. I simply absorbed the reality of the betrayal. Trent was no longer the grieving son of a loyal mechanic. He was a dangerous obstacle that needed to be removed immediately. Lock his terminal, I told Oliver. Oliver tried to isolate Trent's banking portal. It was completely useless. Trent had already logged out of the secure network. The central bank servers were automatically entering their scheduled holiday freeze. No digital solution would work tonight. We could not reverse the override from this office. We needed Trent to manually reverse it from his own authorized executive device. Oliver quickly pulled up Trent's social media accounts and matched them with his corporate out-of-office status. The screen showed a picture of Trent holding a brand new snowboard. He is leaving for a luxury ski vacation in Aspen, Oliver said. The flight and the private chalet were entirely paid for using a corporate credit card Blake opened secretly last week. He is fleeing the crime scene before Christmas morning. Oliver checked the local flight schedules for private and commercial airlines. Trent's private charter departs from the international airport in exactly 2 hours. Once he boards that plane and the clock strikes midnight, the banking freeze becomes permanent. Blake will execute the sale at dawn. The Ironwood Syndicate will take the warehouses. I stood up and buttoned my heavy wool winter coat. We are going to the airport. We left Oliver's office and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. Oliver drove his sleek black sedan. He handled the car with the same aggressive precision he used in a courtroom. The snow fell heavily against the windshield. We tore down the empty interstate toward the international airport. The clock on the dashboard read 2 in the morning. Trent had a flight scheduled for 3:30. I stared out the passenger window at the passing city lights. Trent was a young man I had treated like a son. I paid for his education when his father died on my warehouse floor. Now he was running away to a luxury ski resort with blood money in his pocket. We pulled up to the private aviation terminal. Standard passengers were stuck in miles of security lines at the main gates. I did not wait in lines. I paid millions of dollars a year in corporate aviation fees. I walked straight up to the glass double doors of the Platinum Lounge. The private security guard recognized my face immediately. He stepped aside and swiped his access card without asking a single question. Oliver followed closely behind me with his leather briefcase tucked under his arm. We bypassed the metal detectors and walked onto the plush carpet of the executive concourse. The terminal was quiet. Wealthy travelers slept in leather reclining chairs or drank expensive whiskey at the marble bar. I scanned the room with a practiced eye. I spotted Trent sitting in a secluded corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows. He wore a designer cashmere sweater and held a glass of champagne. His brand new snowboard rested against the glass. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who thought he had just won the lottery. He was about to learn the true cost of his ticket. I walked across the lounge with slow, deliberate steps. My heavy work boots sank into the thick carpet. Trent raised his glass to take another sip of champagne. He stopped mid-motion when he saw me approaching. All the color instantly drained from his face. His hand began to shake. The champagne spilled over the rim of the crystal flute and dripped onto his expensive sweater. He tried to stand up. Oliver stepped forward and placed a heavy hand firmly on Trent's shoulder. Oliver pushed him back down into the leather chair. I sat down directly across from him. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any anger. I looked at him with the cold, detached stare of an employer observing a failed investment. Trent opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by fear. Oliver unzipped his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He dropped it flat on the glass table between us. I slid the folder across the smooth surface until it touched Trent's trembling hands. "Open it," I commanded. Trent slowly lifted the cover. The first page displayed a high-resolution screenshot of the central bank firewall logs. The red lines of code clearly highlighted his unique employee identification number. The second page showed the timestamp of the exact moment he bypassed the biometric security protocol using the fraudulent medical evaluation. The third page held bank statements showing a sudden deposit of $50,000 routed through a shell company directly into his offshore account. "You bypassed a federal corporate lock," I said evenly. "You used a forged psychiatric report to declare me legally dead. You authorized the sale of a $40 million asset to violent criminals. You did all of this using the education I paid for." Trent stared at the papers. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked around the lounge, hoping for security to intervene. No one was paying attention to our quiet corner. "You committed federal wire fraud and corporate espionage," I continued. "The digital footprint is undeniable. Oliver has already drafted the indictment papers. If we hand this folder to the federal authorities waiting outside, you will face 20 years in a maximum security prison. You will lose your career. You will lose your freedom. You will disgrace the memory of your father." The silence between us felt heavier than concrete. Trent buried his face in his hands. He began to weep. "I am sorry," Trent choked out between heavy sobs. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his cashmere sweater. "I did not want to do it, Mr. Wright. Blake approached me 2 weeks ago. He knew I was drowning in student loan debt from my undergraduate degree. He offered me $50,000 in pure cash. He promised me a permanent senior executive position at Hayes Commercial as soon as he finalized the overseas warehouse sale. He told me you were too sick to lead the company anymore." I leaned forward slightly. "You knew I was not sick," I replied. "You knew Blake was a fraud. You chose the money." Trent nodded frantically. He reached into his coat pocket with shaking hands. He pulled out a cheap plastic prepaid cell phone and placed it on the glass table. "Blake gave me this burner phone to coordinate the system override," Trent explained. "He was terrified the bank would track his personal devices. Look at the messages." I unlocked the burner phone. The screen displayed a long chain of encrypted text messages between Blake and a contact labeled Ironwood. I read the exchanges. Blake was updating the Shadow Syndicate on every single movement of the central bank protocols. He promised the violent lenders that the warehouse deed would be completely free and clear by Christmas morning. The messages proved Blake was fully aware of the syndicate's violent methods. He practically begged them for more time. The burner phone was the smoking gun. It proved Blake orchestrated the entire conspiracy. I slid the phone into my jacket pocket. "You have one chance to avoid a federal prison cell," I told Trent. "You are going to fix what you broke right now." Trent hurriedly grabbed his laptop from his carry-on bag. He flipped the screen open and logged into the central bank administrative portal using his secure credentials. His fingers moved frantically across the keyboard. He accessed the core system architecture. "Reinstate the biometric poison pill clause," Oliver ordered, standing over Trent's shoulder. "Do not leave a single back door open." Trent typed in the command codes. He reversed the fraudulent medical override and locked the Southside Warehouse District back under my exclusive physical thumbprint. The screen flashed a brilliant green. The asset was fully secure. Trent slumped back in his chair, exhausted and terrified. "It is done," he whispered. "Nobody can move that property without your physical presence." I stood up and buttoned my heavy wool coat. "Do not board that flight to Aspen," I told him. "You will go home and wait for my call. If you try to run, I will hand the dossier to the authorities." Trent nodded silently. As we turned to leave, Oliver checked his tablet. "The system just generated an automated security alert," Oliver warned. "The bank automatically notified the acting CEO that the biometric lock has been re-established. Blake knows we reversed his override." My son-in-law was now a desperate man backed into a corner with violent loan sharks closing in. He would not just sit back and accept defeat. I was going to strike back. I pulled my Ford truck into the garage just as the sun broke over the horizon. The winter air was bitter and sharp. I walked into my quiet house and locked the door behind me. I did not take off my heavy wool coat. I went straight to the kitchen island and picked up my tablet. I opened the encrypted security application that monitored the perimeter of my estate. I installed those military-grade cameras 10 years ago when local gangs tried to steal copper from my construction sites. Now the equipment was protecting me from my own family. The digital clock on the screen read 7:15 in the morning. A sleek silver sports car skidded into my driveway. The tires spun aggressively against the fresh snow. Blake slammed the transmission into park and threw his door open. He did not bother grabbing his coat. He marched up the heated cobblestone walkway with his fists clenched at his sides. His face was flushed crimson with absolute panic. The automated alert from the central bank had hit his phone. He knew the biometric lock was back in place. He knew his fraudulent sale was completely paralyzed. His shadow syndicate deadline was closing in fast and his stolen key no longer fit the lock. He stormed up my front steps. He looked like a cornered animal. A man who relies on other people's money always breaks when the well runs dry. I watched him on the high-definition feed. He raised his fist and began pounding on my front door. The heavy oak door rattled under the force of his blows. I placed the tablet face down on the granite counter. I let him knock for 2 full minutes. I wanted his anxiety to marinate. When I finally walked to the foyer, I hunched my shoulders slightly. I relaxed my facial muscles to mimic the blank, vacant expression of a fading mind. I unbolted the door and cracked it open. Blake pushed his way inside before I could invite him. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. "What did you do, Javon?" he demanded. His voice echoed harshly in the quiet foyer. "Did you call the central bank? Who helped you access the accounts?" I blinked slowly at him. I rubbed my eyes and let my hands tremble just enough to sell the illusion. I tightened my grip on the doorframe as if I needed it for balance. "Bank," I repeated softly. My voice was intentionally hollow and weak. "Blake, what time is it? Is Kendra here for breakfast?" Blake grabbed my shoulders. His manicured fingers dug painfully into my collarbone. He shook me. "Stop playing games with me, old man," he shouted. "The system triggered a biometric lockdown. My transaction is frozen. Who did you speak to this morning?" I looked down at his expensive leather shoes and then back up to his panicked eyes. I shook my head in slow confusion. "I just woke up, Blake," I whispered. "I could not find my slippers." "Have you seen my leather slippers?" Blake stared at me. He searched my face for any sign of deception. He saw nothing but a hollow shell. His shoulders slumped. He released his grip and stepped back. He realized interrogating a man he believed to be senile was a waste of time. He let out a harsh, desperate curse. He turned around and stormed back out into the freezing cold. I closed the door silently and locked the deadbolt. I dropped the fragile old man act instantly. My spine straightened. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up my tablet. The bait had been swallowed perfectly. I watched the camera feed. Blake did not drive away. He sat inside his silver sports car with the engine running. He gripped his steering wheel and stared blankly at my front door. I knew exactly what he was going to do next. When a coward runs out of options, he calls for reinforcements. I walked into my home office and opened a locked steel drawer. I pulled out a directional parabolic microphone. I bought the device years ago to monitor union disputes on noisy construction sites. It could isolate a whisper from across a crowded lot. I cracked the study window open and aimed the receiver directly at Blake's car. I plugged the audio jack into my digital recorder and pressed the red button. The sound of his heated cabin fan hissed through my earpiece. Then I heard him punching numbers into his phone. "Pick up the phone," Blake muttered. He tapped his fingers nervously against the dashboard. "Doctor, we have a massive problem." The old man must have triggered a failsafe at the bank before his mind went completely dark. "The funds are totally locked." I listened to the muffled voice on the other end of the line. "I do not care about the legal timeline," Blake snapped. "You took my money to handle this. I need you to upgrade his medical file right now. Write the order for an immediate involuntary commitment. State that he is a physical danger to himself and others. I want a transport team at his house tonight. We are bypassing the family court. Just get him locked in a padded room by midnight." Blake ended the call and threw his phone onto the passenger seat. He threw the car into gear and sped out of my driveway. He was going to use raw institutional force to remove me from the board. Men in white coats would arrive at my home under the cover of darkness. They would break down my door and drag me into an ambulance. Once I was strapped to a hospital bed, heavily sedated and stripped of my rights, Blake could petition a sympathetic emergency judge to dissolve the biometric bank locks. He would claim my actions were the dangerous flailings of a madman. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. The battlefield had shifted from the bank to the psychiatric ward. I checked my watch. I had less than 14 hours before a medical extraction team arrived to steal my freedom. I needed to cut off the head of the snake. I picked up my keys and headed back out to my truck. I had to dismantle a corrupt doctor before the sun went down. I called Oliver as I drove down the interstate. I instructed him to meet me at the Oak Ridge Psychiatric Institute in 20 minutes. He did not ask questions. I parked my old Ford work truck next to Oliver's sleek black sedan in the clinic's visitor lot. The building was an architectural monstrosity of reflective glass and cold steel. I laid the foundation for the city's largest public hospital 30 years ago. We built that hospital with reinforced concrete to heal the working class. This private facility was built to separate wealthy families from their trust funds. The parking lot was mostly empty. It was Christmas Eve afternoon. Most legitimate doctors were home with their families. Corrupt men do not take holidays when there is a deadline to meet. Oliver stood by the glass entrance holding his leather briefcase. He had already drafted the necessary legal documents based on my quick phone call. We walked through the automatic sliding doors. The main lobby smelled of expensive lavender and industrial bleach. Piped-in classical music played softly from hidden speakers. The reception desk was completely abandoned. A small sign indicated holiday hours were in effect and only essential emergency staff remained on duty. This worked perfectly to our advantage. I did not want an audience for the surgical dismantling I was about to perform. We bypassed the waiting area and walked straight down the executive corridor. I checked the building directory mounted on the wall. The chief medical officer was Dr. Aris. The heavy door at the end of the hall bore a frosted glass plaque with his name and credentials. He was a man willing to sign away my freedom for a few pieces of silver. I pushed the frosted glass door open without knocking. Dr. Aris sat behind a polished mahogany desk. He was a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and a tailored suit that cost more than my first work truck. He was on the phone. He looked up in sheer irritation at the sudden intrusion. He lowered his phone and demanded to know who let us in. I stepped inside the office and closed the solid wood door behind Oliver. I turned the brass deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. The metallic sound echoed in the spacious room. Dr. Aris stood up from his leather executive chair. He threatened to call security. He reached for the silent panic button mounted under the edge of his desk. Oliver stepped forward and placed his hand firmly over the doctor's wrist. "I suggest you sit back down," Dr. Oliver said in a cold, even tone. "You do not want the police in this room right now." Dr. Aris hesitated. He recognized the aura of a man who destroyed careers for a living. He slowly sank back into his chair. I walked up to the edge of his desk. "My name is Javon Wright," I said. "You evaluated my cognitive function 3 times over the past month. You declared me severely incapacitated. You recommended immediate involuntary commitment." Dr. Aris swallowed hard. The color drained from his face. He recognized the name. He had never actually seen my face before today. Blake handled the paperwork and the bribes entirely in the shadows. Dr. Aris tried to recover his professional arrogance. He claimed patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing the matter. He ordered us to leave his office immediately. I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone I confiscated from Trent at the airport. I placed it directly in the center of his spotless desk. I opened the message thread between Blake and his hired operatives. I scrolled to the messages specifically mentioning the payoffs made to the Oakbridge Clinic. "Blake paid you $100,000 to fabricate a medical diagnosis," I stated. "The transaction details are fully documented on this device. Furthermore, I recorded Blake 30 minutes ago ordering you to escalate the diagnosis to an emergency physical extraction. You agreed to send orderlies to my home tonight to drag me out in a straitjacket. You sold your medical oath to a desperate day trader." Dr. Aris stared at the burner phone. His arrogant facade shattered completely. His hands began to tremble against the mahogany desk. He tried to formulate a denial, but the evidence was absolute. "You are holding a highly illegal recording," he stammered. "A judge will throw it out of court." Oliver unzipped his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and dropped them next to the phone. "The federal government does not need the audio recording," Dr. Oliver replied. "The wire transfers from Blake's shell company directly into your offshore accounts are more than enough to secure a conviction. The United States Department of Justice takes elder abuse and medical fraud very seriously. You will lose your medical license by Monday. You will face a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Your entire legacy will be reduced to a prison sentence." I leaned over the desk. I brought my face inches from his. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, crushing weight of a falling anvil. "You have 2 choices," I told him. "Choice 1 is that Oliver makes a phone call right now. Federal agents will walk through that door and arrest you in front of your remaining staff. You will leave this clinic in handcuffs and you will never practice medicine again. Choice 2 is that you cooperate entirely with me. You will sign a sworn affidavit admitting that Blake orchestrated the entire forgery. You will testify that you never examined me and that my cognitive functions are completely intact. You will state that the initial power of attorney is a fraudulent document procured through bribery. The choice is yours, doctor. Your career or your freedom. Make your decision right now." Dr. Aris slumped forward. He buried his face in his trembling hands. The fight completely left him. He knew he was trapped in a cage of his own making. He reached for a silver fountain pen on his desk. Oliver slid the prepared affidavit across the smooth wood. The doctor signed his name on the dotted line with a shaky hand. He stamped the document with his official medical seal. Oliver placed the paper back into his briefcase and snapped it shut. I now possessed absolute legal proof of my sanity. The fraudulent power of attorney was officially dead. We turned our backs on the ruined doctor and walked out of the clinic. The winter air hit my face as we stepped into the parking lot. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. The medical extraction team would not be coming for me tonight. My empire was secure from the inside. My phone suddenly buzzed in my coat pocket. It was an urgent notification from my home security application. I pulled the device out and opened the live camera feed. Two massive, unmarked black SUVs were parked horizontally across my driveway. 4 men in heavy dark overcoats were standing on my front porch. They were not medical orderlies. They were enforcers from the Ironwood Syndicate. Blake had failed to deliver the overseas money. The loan sharks had come early to take physical possession of their collateral. I told Oliver to drive back to his office and prepare the final legal filings. I did not want a corporate lawyer bleeding on my front steps. I navigated my Ford truck through the winding residential streets. I drove with aggressive purpose. The frigid winter wind cut through my wool coat the moment I pulled onto my private heated driveway. I parked my heavy rusted truck directly behind the 2 black SUVs blocking my garage. I stepped out into the freezing air. 4 men stood on my property. 2 guarded the vehicles with their hands buried deep in their pockets. 2 massive men in heavy dark overcoats waited on my front porch. They stood with the relaxed, arrogant posture of predators who expect completely easy prey. They thought they were here to bully a senile 70-year-old man out of his home. I walked up the cobblestone path. My heavy work boots crunched against the thin layer of ice. The lead enforcer stepped forward. He was a mountain of muscle with a thick scar running down his jawline. He looked down at my worn boots and my chipped truck. He assumed I was a confused old bricklayer who had wandered into the wrong high society neighborhood. He did not realize I owned the concrete he was standing on. "Are you Javon Wright?" the enforcer asked. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that carried across the quiet lawn. I stopped at the base of the stairs. I did not break eye contact. "I am the owner of this estate," I replied evenly. "You are blocking my driveway." The enforcer let out a short, harsh laugh. He exchanged a look of pure amusement with his partner. "Not anymore, old man," he said. "We are the new owners. You have 10 minutes to pack a bag and vacate the premises." I walked up the remaining steps and stood directly in front of my heavy oak door. I did not reach for my keys. I folded my hands firmly behind my back. "You are trespassing," I stated. The second enforcer stepped up. He was shorter but wider, with the broken nose of a career bare-knuckle fighter. He pulled a folded legal document from his overcoat. "Your son-in-law Blake took a $5 million bridge loan from our employers," he explained. "I used this residential estate and the Southside Warehouse District as physical collateral. He missed his preliminary interest payment this afternoon. The Ironwood Syndicate does not grant extensions. We are taking possession of the assets right now." He shoved the document toward my chest. I did not raise my hands to take it. The paper fluttered to the frozen porch. "Blake forged the signature on those documents," I said. "You are holding a worthless piece of paper." The lead enforcer dropped his amused smile. His eyes hardened into cold, flat discs. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," he growled. "We do not care about your family drama. We do not care about forged signatures or court dates. We operate outside the jurisdiction of your civil courts. Blake owes us money. He gave us this address. We are taking the house." He reached past me and grabbed the heavy brass handle of my front door. He expected it to be locked. I had disengaged the primary deadbolt remotely using my phone while walking up the path. The door swung wide open. The 2 men pushed violently past me into my grand foyer. Their heavy boots tracked dirty snow across the imported marble floor. They walked into the center of my living room and began looking around at the expensive artwork and designer furniture. They acted like they had just won a prize. They thought sheer physical intimidation would force me to surrender my kingdom without a fight. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The heavy oak sealed shut with a solid, definitive thud. "You just made a fatal miscalculation," I told them. The lead enforcer turned around with a menacing scowl. He reached inside his coat. I did not flinch. I reached into my own pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped a single application icon. A soft mechanical hum echoed from the high ceiling of the living room. The thugs looked up in confusion. A massive high-definition projector screen dropped down from a concealed recess above the fireplace. The screen flickered to life. It displayed a grid of 12 live camera feeds. The cameras captured every angle of my estate, including the 2 enforcers standing in my foyer. Red recording icons blinked steadily in the corner of each feed. I tapped another button. A secondary screen popped up displaying a direct encrypted uplink to a private armed security contractor. "You are currently standing inside a primary residential node of Hayes Commercial," I explained. My voice was utterly devoid of fear. "This property is heavily fortified. Those cameras are directly linked to an off-site tactical team. More importantly, this footage is automatically uploaded to a federal server. If you draw a weapon or damage a single piece of furniture, heavily armed men will breach that door in 3 minutes. You will be arrested for armed robbery and domestic terrorism on a federally protected corporate zone." The two enforcers froze. They were accustomed to terrifying weak, desperate men. They were not accustomed to walking into a high-tech surveillance trap. The shorter man slowly pulled his hand away from his coat pocket. "You cannot protect the warehouses, old man," the lead enforcer sneered. "We have crews ready to burn them to the ground tonight." I shook my head slowly. "You are not going to burn my warehouses," I replied. "You are going to hunt down the man who actually stole your money." I walked over to the entryway console table. I picked up a thick manila envelope I had prepared earlier. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table directly in front of them. The heavy package landed with a loud smack. "Open it," I commanded. The lead enforcer hesitated before tearing the envelope open. He pulled out the real corporate financial ledgers Oliver and I had uncovered. I highlighted the exact transactions where Blake transferred your $5 million into highly leveraged offshore cryptocurrency accounts, I stated. "Blake lost every single penny of your money 2 weeks ago. He lied about the collateral. My biometric locks prevent any transfer of those properties. He used you to cover his tracks." The enforcer stared at the printed ledgers. His face twisted into a mask of pure murderous rage. Blake was not a strategic partner. Blake was a thief who stole from the mob. "Take those files back to your bosses," I told them. "Do what you must to collect your debt from Blake. But if you ever step foot on my property again, I will send this footage to the federal authorities." The two men did not say another word. They turned around and marched out of my house. The black SUVs sped out of my driveway. The syndicate was now hunting Blake, but my arrogant son-in-law still believed he was safe. He still thought he was meeting a wealthy foreign developer tomorrow morning to finalize his fake sale. He had no idea he was walking straight into a slaughterhouse. I watched the two black SUVs disappear down the icy street through my high-definition security monitors. The heavy winter snow quickly covered their tire tracks. The Ironwood Syndicate was no longer my problem to manage. They were a highly lethal heat-seeking missile aimed directly at the chest of my arrogant son-in-law. But Blake was completely oblivious to the massive danger closing in on him. He still believed he held a winning hand in a high-stakes game. He still thought his ultimate salvation was arriving on a private jet tomorrow morning. Blake was banking his entire existence on a wealthy overseas developer who had promised to buy the Southside Warehouse District for $25 million in pure unrecorded cash. Blake desperately needed $5 million to pay off the syndicate and keep his kneecaps intact. He planned to quietly pocket the remaining $20 million and flee to a non-extradition country with my daughter by the end of the week. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect corporate heist right under the nose of a senile old bricklayer. He did not realize he was just a blind rat running through a complex legal maze I had meticulously built with Oliver. I walked to my kitchen island and poured a glass of cold water. I drank it slowly while staring at the blinking red recording light on my security system. I needed to ensure Blake walked directly into the center of that maze before the steel trap permanently snapped shut. He thought he was manipulating the commercial real estate market to cover his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. He was actually playing a game of physical survival against men who killed for sport. I picked up my cell phone to call my attorney. I dialed Oliver on a secure, encrypted line. I told him the Ironwood enforcers had taken the bait and left my property. They knew Blake lost their money and lied about the collateral. Oliver let out a short, hard laugh. He knew the syndicate would show zero mercy to a white-collar fraudster. "Then it is time to deploy our buyer," Oliver stated plainly. I agreed completely. 3 weeks ago, when Oliver first uncovered Blake actively shopping the warehouse district to foreign buyers, we made our preemptive countermove. We intercepted his digital corporate inquiries. We routed his frantic emails through a secure dummy server located in Eastern Europe. The billionaire real estate mogul from Dubai that Blake had been courting for 2 weeks simply did not exist. The man stepping off a private plane tomorrow morning was a highly skilled undercover corporate investigator named Marcus Thorne. Oliver kept Marcus on a lucrative retainer specifically for corporate espionage and internal sting operations. Marcus wore custom Italian suits and spoke flawless Arabic and French. He exuded the exact kind of arrogant generational wealth that a desperate man like Blake would blindly trust and seek to impress. We set the meeting for 8 o'clock on Christmas morning at the most exclusive private dining club in the financial district. Blake booked a private room to ensure absolute secrecy for his treasonous transaction. He wanted a quiet, isolated space to sign over my empire without raising any alarms. He was going to get a quiet space to confess his federal crimes on high-definition video. Oliver had already bribed the club manager to wire the private dining room with hidden cameras and military-grade audio transmitters. I told Oliver to send me the encrypted secure link. I wanted a front-row seat to watch my son-in-law sell his soul. Christmas morning arrived with a bitter, blinding frost. I sat in my quiet study with a hot cup of black coffee. I opened the secure application link on my tablet. The live digital feed showed the elegant interior of the private dining club. Blake sat nervously at a long, polished mahogany table. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and checked his expensive gold watch every 30 seconds. He was sweating despite the heavy air conditioning in the room. Marcus entered the dining area exactly on time. He looked like a man who bought and sold skyscrapers for sport. Blake stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his heavy wooden chair. He shook Marcus by the hand and eagerly offered him coffee and breakfast. Marcus sat down and cut straight to the point. He demanded verbal confirmation that Blake held absolute legal authority to sell the Southside properties without any interference from the original founder. I sipped my dark coffee and listened closely to the audio feed. Blake smiled a greasy, confident smile. He reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out the fraudulent medical power of attorney. He slid the forged document across the table. My father-in-law built a great company, but his mind is completely gone, Blake lied smoothly. He does not even know his own name anymore. He is practically a vegetable sitting in a wheelchair. I have full executive and medical control of the estate. The state court signed off on it yesterday morning. It was chilling to hear a man casually erase my humanity to seal a business deal. Marcus reviewed the forged document. He nodded slowly, playing his part to absolute perfection. He placed the fake medical file into his own briefcase, ensuring we now had physical possession of the evidence. I accept these terms, Marcus said in a smooth, practiced tone. I will authorize the transfer of $25 million for the purchase of the warehouses. Blake let out a loud, heavy breath of absolute relief. He practically vibrated with excitement. But there is a standard international security protocol, Marcus continued without missing a beat. He pulled a thick contract from his jacket pocket. Given the strict holiday banking restrictions, the funds will be placed into a secure third-party escrow account immediately. They will not be released into your offshore accounts until exactly 8 in the morning on December 26th. We must ensure the deed transfers cleanly when the federal courts open after the holiday. The color instantly drained from the face of my son-in-law. His confident, arrogant smile collapsed into a rigid mask of pure terror. December 26th, Blake stammered. He tried to keep his voice steady, but sheer panic leaked through every single syllable. I need the liquid capital today. I have immediate operational costs that cannot wait. Marcus stood up and calmly buttoned his tailored suit jacket. Those are my terms, Blake. Take it or leave it. Marcus walked out of the private room without another glance. He left the fake contract sitting on the mahogany table. The hidden camera zoomed in on Blake. He buried his face in his trembling hands. The Ironwood Syndicate deadline was midnight tonight. If he did not produce $5 million in pure cash, they would take his life. He was trapped in a lethal waiting game. Desperation pushed him over the edge of reason. He picked up his phone and dialed his mother-in-law. He needed to find a new target. I sat in my study watching the snow fall against the large bay windows. The digital trap was fully set. Blake was running out of oxygen at his downtown meeting. My driveway security alert chimed softly. I checked the live feed on my tablet, expecting the Ironwood Syndicate to return with more muscle to collect their debt. Instead, I saw a pristine white Bentley pull up to my front steps. 2 people stepped out into the freezing afternoon air. It was my former wife, Vanessa, and her new husband, Glenn. They were completely uninvited. They walked up my pathway wrapped in thick cashmere coats and designer leather gloves. Vanessa wore her wealth like a weapon to intimidate anyone she viewed as beneath her. Designer leather gloves. Vanessa wore her wealth like a weapon to intimidate anyone she viewed as beneath her. I walked to the front foyer and unlocked the heavy oak door before they could ring the bell. Vanessa stepped inside without wiping the snow from her expensive boots. She looked around my modest entryway with her signature expression of profound disappointment. She expected me to live in a sprawling mansion dripping with gold leaf and imported chandeliers. She hated that I chose to stay in the sturdy brick home I built 40 years ago. Glenn stood right behind her, blocking the doorway. He wore a tailored camel hair coat and a highly condescending smile. He carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man born into old money, who thought he was inherently superior to a working man. "Javon, you look incredibly tired," Vanessa said. Her voice carried a sharp edge wrapped in fake concern. I did not ask them to come inside. I stood with my hands clasped firmly behind my back, blocking the hallway. "What do you want, Vanessa?" I asked evenly. "We are here to talk about reality, Javon," she replied. She brushed past me into the living room as if her name was still on the deed. Glenn followed her closely, stepping onto my hardwood floors. Vanessa stood in the center of my living room, examining my worn leather armchair and the simple brick fireplace. "You have tens of millions of dollars in the bank and you still live like a day laborer," she stated. She crossed her arms tightly across her expensive cashmere coat. "This is exactly why our marriage failed. I spent 30 years trying to elevate you. I tried to bring you into polite high society. You always preferred the dirt. You came home every single night smelling like wet concrete and heavy diesel exhaust. You absolutely refused to wash the working class out of your skin." I looked at her without flinching. "That concrete and diesel paid for every diamond currently hanging around your neck," I replied. "I built the massive financial foundation you used to climb away from me." Vanessa scoffed and waved her hand dismissively. She gestured toward Glenn. "Glenn understands how wealth is supposed to be managed," she said proudly. "He comes from a lineage of refined investors. He knows how to live properly. You just hoard cash in a damp house. That brings us to why we are here today. Kendra called me this morning. She told me about your rapidly deteriorating mental state. I did not correct her. I let her reveal the depths of her complicity in the plot against my life." "Blake is making the right decisions," Vanessa continued. "He found a premier memory care facility for you. They have round-the-clock nurses and beautiful, secure gardens. You need to stop fighting this transition. You are becoming a dangerous burden to your own daughter. You need to step aside and accept the medical commitment voluntarily. If you refuse, Blake will be forced to drag you through a humiliating public court battle. You owe it to Kendra to transfer your wealth gracefully before your mind completely rots away. She deserves her rightful inheritance now. She deserves to enjoy the money while she is young. You are hoarding a fortune you no longer have the cognitive capacity to understand or manage." I turned my attention away from Vanessa and focused entirely on her refined husband. Glenn stood near the fireplace with his hands resting casually in his coat pockets. The sleeve of his coat was pulled back just enough to reveal a heavy platinum timepiece on his left wrist. It was an exclusive Swiss watch. I recognized the exact model. It retailed for over $80,000. "That is a beautiful watch, Glenn," I said calmly. Glenn smiled and adjusted his cuff to show it off further. "Thank you, Javon. It is a prestigious family heirloom. I acquired it from a private dealer in Geneva. A real man must invest in quality." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my secure tablet. I opened the encrypted corporate accounting application. I navigated to the hidden credit ledger Oliver and I had uncovered just hours ago. "Let me tell you about quality, Glenn," I said. I tapped the screen and opened a specific transaction record. This watch was not purchased in Geneva. It was purchased exactly 3 weeks ago at a luxury boutique downtown. It was paid for using a corporate platinum credit card. The card is registered directly to Hayes Commercial. Blake opened the account secretly using my forged signature. I scrolled down the glowing screen, reading the itemized billing history out loud in the quiet room. "You have a massive reckless spending habit, Glenn. You charged $40,000 for private country club dues. You charged $15,000 for bespoke Italian suits. You even charged Vanessa's new white Bentley lease directly to my logistics company." Glenn dropped his arrogant smile instantly. His face turned the color of wet ash. He took a sudden step back away from the fireplace. "You are lying," he stammered nervously. His voice cracked. "My private investments pay for my lifestyle." "Your investments do not exist," I stated flatly. "You are completely broke, Glenn. You are a financial parasite leeching off the stolen funds of a desperate day trader. Blake is using my embezzled corporate money to finance your fake aristocratic life, so you will help convince my daughter to lock me in a psychiatric ward." Vanessa stared at her husband in absolute horror. She looked at the expensive watch on his wrist and the designer coat on his shoulders. "You told me your family trust fund covered these expenses," she whispered. Her voice trembled with the sudden crashing weight of reality. "You married a fraud, Vanessa," I said. "Now get out of my house, both of you." Vanessa did not argue. She spun around and marched toward the front door with furious, heavy steps. Glenn scrambled after her, begging her to listen to his frantic excuses. I watched them stumble out into the freezing snow. Vanessa pulled her phone out of her designer purse before she even reached the passenger door of the leased Bentley. She was dialing Kendra furiously. The grand illusion of Blake's massive success was about to be shattered by her own mother. Blake thought he had completely isolated me. He did not realize I just used his own mother-in-law to detonate a bomb inside his marriage. The internal collapse of my enemy's camp had officially begun. Blake was running out of oxygen. The overseas buyer had stalled the massive payment and the Ironwood syndicate had already paid a visit to my front porch. Blake knew the loan sharks were sharpening their knives. He He needed to offer them a monumental gesture of good faith to prove his loyalty. He needed to prove he had absolute physical control of the collateral, even if the liquid cash was temporarily delayed. Desperation makes a man incredibly stupid. Blake decided to bypass city zoning laws and commercial development permits entirely. He hired a private, unauthorized demolition crew known for working off the books. He instructed them to mobilize immediately and tear down the Southside warehouses on the afternoon of Christmas Eve. He thought leveling the massive structures would show the syndicate he was actively preparing the land for a lucrative resale. I thought clear open land would act as a temporary shield against their impending violence. He did not care that hundreds of my union drivers kept their specialized tools and personal vehicles parked inside those secure buildings. He did not care about the millions of dollars in stored logistics equipment waiting to be shipped across the country. He only cared about saving his own life from men who broke bones for a living. The demolition order was an act of pure reckless panic. He wired the wrecking crew an enormous cash bonus using my stolen corporate funds to guarantee they would work through the sacred holiday. He told them to start the bulldozers at exactly 3 in the afternoon and flatten the primary dispatch hub before the sun went down. I sat in my quiet living room watching the heavy snow pile up against the window panes. My secure tablet vibrated violently on the glass coffee table. A high-priority alert flashed across the digital screen. The motion sensors at the Southside Warehouse District had just been tripped. I opened the live security feed and stared at the monitor. 3 massive yellow bulldozers and 2 heavy wrecking excavators had just rolled blindly through the main wrought iron gates. A dozen men in yellow hard hats were aggressively unloading demolition equipment from flatbed trailers. I did not waste time calling the local police department. I buttoned my heavy wool coat and walked straight out to my frigid garage. I climbed into the cab of my original 1980 Ford work truck. The heavy 8-cylinder engine roared to life with a comforting rumble. I drove out into the freezing afternoon. I tore down the icy abandoned streets toward the industrial district. Those warehouses were a living monument to my youth. I laid the concrete foundation for the primary dispatch hub when I was 25 years old. I bled on that soil to build a future for my family. I was not going to let a terrified day trader erase my history just to appease a gang of merciless loan sharks. I reached the main entrance of the sprawling lot. The demolition crew had already positioned the lead bulldozer facing the primary brick dispatch center. The massive steel blade was lowered and ready to strike. The diesel engine idled loudly, blowing thick plumes of black smoke into the bitter winter air. The foreman was shouting aggressive orders over the mechanical roar. I did not tap my brakes. I drove my rusted truck straight through the open iron gates. I accelerated across the frozen, cracked asphalt and slammed the brakes at the very last possible second. I parked my truck diagonally directly in front of the lead bulldozer. The heavy steel blade stopped less than 2 feet from my passenger door. I turned off the ignition and pulled the keys out. I stepped out of the truck and planted my heavy boots firmly on the frozen ground. The foreman rushed toward me, waving his thick arms frantically. He yelled at me to move my vehicle immediately, or it would be crushed into scrap metal. I crossed my arms over my chest and stood perfectly still. I told him he was trespassing on private property. I told him to turn off his machines right now. A silver sports car careened into the lot right behind me. Blake slammed the car into park and jumped out into the freezing wind. He marched toward the demolition line with pure, unadulterated venom in his eyes. He saw me standing calmly in front of the massive bulldozer and his face turned bright red with absolute fury. He ordered the foreman to physically remove me from the premises at once. He shouted that he was the acting chief executive of the company and that I was nothing but a confused trespasser on his active development site. The foreman looked between us with clear hesitation, weighing his options. I reached inside the deep pocket of my heavy wool coat. I pulled out a thick legal document sealed in a transparent weatherproof folder. I did not hand it to my screaming son-in-law. I handed it directly to the demolition foreman. "Read the federal stamp at the top of the page," I commanded. The foreman took the folder and his eyes scanned the heavy black text. 3 years ago, I anticipated the relentless gentrification of the Southside District. Corporate developers were circling the area like hungry vultures looking for cheap land. I hired a specialized legal team to secure a certified environmental injunction. I legally registered the entire warehouse grounds as a federally protected historical industrial site. The soil beneath the asphalt contained residual industrial runoff from the early 20th century. Any unapproved excavation or demolition would automatically trigger a massive hazardous materials violation. Moving a single brick required a 12-month federal review process and explicit approval from the Environmental Protection Agency. Blake stared at me in absolute shock. He He had no idea this injunction even existed because he never bothered to read the foundational corporate files. He only cared about skimming the quarterly profit margins. The foreman shoved the document aggressively back into Blake's chest. The man was a rough street-level contractor, but he was not stupid. He knew the sheer destructive power of the federal government. He told Blake that his crew would absolutely not face prison time and million-dollar fines for violating environmental protection laws just to earn a holiday bonus. The foreman turned around and blew a loud, piercing whistle. I made a sharp horizontal hand gesture signaling his entire crew to stand down immediately. The loud diesel engines cut off one by one. The bulldozers shifted into reverse and backed away from my brick dispatch center. Blake screamed at the men to stop. He promised them double their original payment in untraceable cash. He begged them to tear down just one single building to prove a point. The crew completely ignored his frantic pleas. They loaded their heavy machinery back onto the flatbed trailers and drove quickly off the lot. Blake was left standing completely alone in the freezing dirt. His silver sports car and his expensive tailored suit looked entirely out of place in my gritty industrial yard. The syndicate deadline was creeping closer by the minute. His fake overseas buyer had stalled the escrow payment. His rushed demolition plan had just evaporated into thin air. He had absolutely zero leverage left on the board. He glared at me with the manic, wide-eyed desperation of a drowning man. He realized he could not legally sell my assets to save himself. He decided he was going to steal my physical wealth directly. The demolition crew was gone. The fake overseas developer had frozen the escrow funds. The Ironwood Syndicate was sharpening their knives for a midnight collection. Blake was entirely out of options. A man with no legal leverage and no liquid cash will inevitably turn to brute force robbery. He needed untraceable portable wealth immediately. I knew exactly where his desperate mind would go next. Deep beneath the corporate headquarters of Hayes Commercial, I maintained a fortified subterranean vault. It was a relic from the early days of my empire when I dealt heavily in cash and hard assets. Blake knew about the vault. He had seen the audit reports during his brief tenure as acting chief executive. He calculated the current market value of those heavy gold bars. A single canvas duffel bag filled with bullion would be worth easily over $5 million. It was the exact amount he needed to pay off the violent loan sharks breathing down his neck. Blake realized he could not sell my real estate, but he thought he could simply walk into my headquarters and steal my physical gold. He planned to execute a midnight heist right in the middle of his own lavish Christmas Eve party. He assumed the corporate building would be completely abandoned for the holiday. He assumed the security protocols were standard. He assumed wrong on every possible level. I did not just anticipate his next move. I actively paved the road for him to walk down. The underground vault required a level 9 biometric security badge to initiate the exterior elevator sequence. Blake did not possess that clearance. His acting chief executive keycard was restricted to the upper administrative floors. He needed my personal master badge to bypass the primary perimeter alarms. I drove my Ford truck back to my house after the demolition crew retreated. I knew Blake would come looking for me. He would try to salvage his position or search my property for anything he could leverage. I walked into my kitchen and took my heavy encrypted master security badge off my keychain. I placed it directly in the center of the granite kitchen island. I made sure the shiny metallic corporate logo was highly visible under the pendant lights. I left the house and drove to Oliver's office to monitor the network. I intentionally left my back door unlocked. My driveway security cameras caught Blake sneaking through my backyard less than an hour later. He moved with the frantic, sloppy urgency of an amateur thief. He slipped through the unlocked door and stepped into my kitchen. He saw the master badge sitting alone on the island. The cameras captured his face lighting up with absolute greedy salvation. He snatched the badge off the granite and shoved it deep into his tailored suit pocket. He thought he had stumbled upon a lucky break. I thought my supposed dementia caused me to leave my most vital security pass unattended. He had no idea he was picking up the exact piece of cheese I placed on the mousetrap. I watched him run back to his car and speed away toward his $2 million estate. He had to go host his high society Christmas party and pretend he was a wildly successful mogul. He had to pour expensive champagne for his elite guests while secretly plotting to rob his father-in-law blind. The stage was perfectly set. The thief had his key. The sun went down and the city froze over for Christmas Eve. I sat in Oliver's downtown war room watching the live security feeds from the Hayes Commercial headquarters. At 10:45 at night, a black luxury sedan pulled into the abandoned corporate parking structure. Blake stepped out wearing a dark trench coat over his expensive tuxedo. He carried a heavy-duty canvas duffel bag over his shoulder. He swiped my stolen master badge at the private underground loading dock. The heavy steel doors parted smoothly. He bypassed the empty security desk and took the freight elevator down to the subterranean level. The camera feeds tracked his every single movement. He approached the massive circular vault door. He swiped my badge a second time and punched in the standard administrative override code he learned from the employee handbook. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a deep mechanical groan. Blake pulled the heavy steel door open and stepped inside the secure room. The shelves were lined with hundreds of gleaming gold bars. His eyes widened with absolute frantic greed. He dropped to his knees and unzipped the large canvas duffel bag. He began grabbing the heavy bullion and shoving it into the bag. He was sweating profusely through his designer clothes. He moved with reckless desperation, breathing heavily in the quiet vault. He packed the bag until the canvas strained against the sharp corners of the metal bars. He thought he had just secured his freedom. He thought he had saved his own life. The moment Blake pulled the heavy zipper closed on the duffel bag, I tapped a single command on my tablet. The subterranean vault immediately went into a total lockdown sequence. The primary steel door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. A dozen blinding white security lights flared to life, illuminating every inch of the room. High-definition cameras descended from the ceiling and captured his terrified face from 4 different angles. Blake dropped the bag and slammed his fists against the locked steel door. He screamed in pure panic. He was trapped inside a federal-level security cage holding millions in stolen corporate assets. He was entirely caught red-handed on video. I let him suffer in the blinding light for exactly 2 minutes. I wanted the cameras to record every drop of sweat and every frantic scream. Then I pressed the release button on my screen. The heavy vault door clicked open. Blake did not hesitate. He grabbed the heavy duffel bag and ran for his life. He scrambled into the freight elevator and fled into the freezing night. He thought he got lucky a second time. He thought a system glitch let him escape with my fortune. He was completely wrong. I let him run because the heavy bars inside that bag were not pure gold. They were cheap tungsten props from a movie set my company transported 10 years ago. Blake was rushing to pay off violent loan sharks with a bag full of completely worthless painted metal. I sat in Oliver's downtown office and watched the live feed of the freight elevator. Blake sprinted through the underground parking garage, clutching the heavy canvas duffel bag. He threw it into the trunk of his silver sports car and sped off into the freezing night. He actually believed he was driving back to his high society Christmas party with $5 million in pure gold. He thought he had outsmarted a man who spent 40 years calculating risk. I turned my attention away from the security cameras. I needed to see exactly how much collateral damage Blake had inflicted on my own blood. I opened my encrypted tablet and accessed the primary family trust records. I set up a private generational wealth fund for my daughter the day she was born. I poured millions of dollars into that account to ensure she would never have to lay bricks in the freezing rain like I did. I pulled up the transaction history for Kendra's personal portfolio. The screen flooded with red withdrawal notices. Blake had not just destroyed the corporate ledger, he had systematically drained my daughter's private trust fund over the past 72 hours. He executed a series of massive wire transfers directly into the Ironwood Syndicate holding accounts just to cover his late penalty fees. He bled his own wife dry to buy himself a few extra days of breathing room. He stole her future to protect his fragile ego. The balance at the bottom of the screen read absolute zero. He had left her with absolutely nothing. I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. I had to warn her before the syndicate crashed her party. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Kendra's personal number. She answered on the 4th ring. I could hear the loud, rhythmic thumping of a jazz band playing in the background. High society guests were laughing and clinking champagne glasses inside the $2 million estate I bought for her. "What do you want, Dad?" she asked over the loud music. Her voice dripped with deep irritation. "I told you Glenn is here and we are entertaining very important people. I do not have time for an argument tonight." I ignored her condescending tone. I spoke with absolute clarity. "Open your banking application on your phone right now, Kendra," I commanded. "Look at the balance in your primary trust account." I heard her sigh loudly into the receiver. She complained about my controlling behavior, but I heard the faint tapping of her fingers against her screen. A heavy silence suddenly fell over the line. The jazz music in the background seemed to fade away. "What did you do to my money?" she whispered. Her voice trembled with sudden panic. "My account is completely empty." I leaned forward in my leather chair. "I did not touch your money, Kendra," I replied evenly. "Your visionary husband drained your entire trust fund. Blake wired every single dollar to a violent shadow lending syndicate to cover his catastrophic losses in the cryptocurrency market. He stole your inheritance to save his own life." Kendra let out a sharp, harsh gasp. But she did not direct her anger at the man who robbed her. She directed her fury entirely at me. "You are lying," she shouted through the phone. Her panic instantly warped into vicious denial. "You froze my accounts. You locked away my money just to punish me for uninviting you to the Christmas party. You are trying to sabotage Blake because you cannot stand the fact that he is a better businessman than you. You always use money to control me." I stared at the glowing red numbers on my tablet. My own daughter was looking at a mathematically verifiable theft, and she chose to blame the man who built the vault. "Blake told me you were losing your mind," she snapped. "I see he was completely right. You are a bitter old man trying to destroy my marriage out of pure spite." "You need to open your eyes, Kendra," I told her firmly. "Blake is returning to your house right now with a bag full of fake gold. He tried to steal from my corporate vault. The syndicate is going to demand real cash tonight. They will tear down your perfect life." Kendra let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "Blake is a financial visionary," she declared proudly. "He is executing complex, high-yield mergers that you could never possibly comprehend. You are just a jealous old-fashioned bricklayer who got lucky buying cheap land 30 years ago. You do not understand modern wealth." A digital notification chimed on my tablet. I opened the alert. It was a terrifying legal update from the Family Trust portal. Kendra was actively executing a digital asset waiver on her phone while speaking to me. She was officially transferring the remaining legal equity of her residential estate directly into Blake's sole possession. She thought she was protecting her assets from a crazy old man. She was actually handing the deed of her home directly to the man who owed the mob $5 million. "I just signed the emergency transfer protocols," Kendra stated with arrogant satisfaction. "Blake warned me you might try to illegally seize my properties. He told me to transfer everything into his holding company for protection. You cannot touch us anymore, Dad. We are completely insulated from your toxic control." I watched the transfer complete on my screen. The $2 million house I bought for her was now legally available for the syndicate to seize. I sat back in my chair and looked at the digital confirmation. The betrayal was absolute. I had spent my entire life building a fortress to protect my daughter from the harsh realities of the world. That fortress had turned her into an arrogant, entitled fool who worshipped a fraudster. She chose a liar over the man who gave her everything. I realized in that quiet room that I could no longer save her from the fallout. She had deliberately tied herself to a sinking ship. She needed to hit the ocean floor to understand the true weight of her decisions. "I will not interfere anymore, Kendra," I said quietly. "You have made your choice. You must now survive the consequences." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk. I turned to Oliver. He had been listening to the entire exchange in silence. The time for private interventions was officially over. Blake and Kendra wanted to play the roles of elite, untouchable aristocrats. I was going to give them an audience. I stood up and buttoned my heavy wool coat. "Contact the mayor, Oliver," I instructed. "We are going to broadcast the truth to the entire city." I left Oliver in his office to finalize the legal transfer documents. I drove my Ford truck through the wealthy historical district of the city. The streets were lined with ancient oak trees draped in brilliant white holiday lights. I pulled into the circular driveway of the mayor's private residence. The dashboard clock read exactly 9 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve. I did not care about interrupting a family holiday. I walked up to the grand entrance and rang the heavy brass doorbell. The mayor opened the door himself. Mayor Marcus Thorne was a man who understood the fundamental mechanics of power in this city. He was a seasoned politician, but he was also a realist. We had known each other for 25 years. I funded his earliest city council campaigns when no one else believed in his vision. I built the infrastructure that transformed his crumbling municipal districts into thriving commercial zones. He looked at my heavy wool coat and my grim expression. He did not offer me a festive greeting. He knew I did not make unannounced personal visits unless the foundation of the city was shaking. He immediately stepped aside and ushered me into his private home office. The room smelled of expensive cigars and burning cedar wood. He offered me a seat in a high-backed leather chair. I remained standing. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the original certified deed to the Southside Warehouse District. I placed the heavy stack of legal parchment directly onto his polished wooden desk. I looked him dead in the eyes. I told him we were going to make history tonight. The mayor looked down at the documents resting on his desk. He recognized the property boundaries immediately. The Southside Warehouse District was the most highly coveted piece of commercial real estate in the entire metropolitan area. Corporate developers had been lobbying his office for years trying to rezone that specific land for luxury high-rise condominiums. I placed my calloused hands flat on the edges of his desk. "I am officially transferring absolute ownership of the entire $40 million property to the city," I stated. "I am executing an irrevocable charitable donation effective immediately." The mayor stared at me in absolute shock. He leaned back in his leather chair and took a deep breath. He asked me what strings were attached to a $40 million gift. I told him there was only one unyielding condition. The land could never be sold to a private commercial developer. The city must use the existing infrastructure to build a state-of-the-art youth athletic and vocational training center. I wanted the rusted warehouses transformed into indoor basketball courts, boxing gyms, and technical workshops. I wanted the kids growing up in the harshest neighborhoods to have a safe fortress where they could learn how to lay bricks, weld steel, and build their own futures. I wanted them to learn the exact same trade skills that saved my life 50 years ago. I refused to let my legacy be bulldozed to build glass towers for out-of-town billionaires. I refused to let an arrogant day trader use my life work as collateral for violent loan sharks. The land was going back to the working class. The donation would completely shield the property from any private liens or fraudulent claims. It would transform Blake's forged syndicate collateral into a massive federally protected public asset. The Ironwood Syndicate would never dare seize a municipal youth center backed by the local government and the police department. They would have to turn around and collect their $5 million debt directly from the flesh and bone of my son-in-law. I laid the transfer agreements next to the deed. I told the mayor this was his legacy-making moment. The mayor picked up his reading glasses. He carefully read through the irrevocable donation clause. His hands trembled slightly, holding the heavy parchment. He knew a public project of this massive magnitude would guarantee his re-election for the next decade. He also knew a transaction of this scale usually required months of committee hearings and bureaucratic red tape. He looked up at me and asked if we could schedule a formal signing ceremony at City Hall after the holiday weekend. I slammed my hand down on the desk. A sharp crack echoed through the quiet office. "We are not waiting for a ceremony," I commanded. "We are executing this transaction right now." I brought a certified public notary with me. Oliver stepped into the home office from the hallway holding his official notary stamp. I had instructed him to follow me in his sedan for this exact purpose. I told the mayor the paperwork must be signed, sealed, and entered into the municipal digital registry tonight. Furthermore, I demanded a live public announcement. I needed the entire city to know the property had permanently changed hands. I needed the violent creditors breathing down Blake's neck to see the absolute legal transfer of their stolen collateral. If the announcement waited until morning, Blake would have time to muddy the waters with his fake overseas buyer. The trap had to snap shut while the prey was completely blind. I handed the mayor a silver pen. I told him to sign the papers, or I would take the $40 million donation to the neighboring county. The mayor did not hesitate any further. He gripped the silver pen and signed his name aggressively across the bottom of the donation contract. Oliver immediately stamped the documents with his heavy brass seal, making the transfer legally absolute and entirely irreversible. The Southside Warehouse District now belonged to the city. The mayor grabbed his cell phone and dialed his director of communications. He ordered his press team to mobilize immediately. He demanded they contact the local television networks and interrupt the scheduled holiday programming. He arranged for an emergency live broadcast from his private estate at exactly 11:30 tonight. The news vans began racing toward the wealthy historical district. The cameras were being set up in his grand living room. The clock was ticking closer to midnight. The ultimate asset Blake used to buy his freedom was about to vanish permanently in front of millions of viewers. My son-in-law was currently standing in a mansion sipping expensive champagne and dreaming of a wealthy escape. He was completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had just been vaporized. I sat in the passenger seat of my Ford truck parked 2 blocks away from the mayor's residence. I opened the master security application on my tablet. I bought Kendra's $2 million estate. I installed the perimeter surveillance system myself before Blake even moved in. He never bothered to change the master administrator codes. The digital clock on the screen read 10:45. The live feed from the rear service alley illuminated the darkness in crisp infrared. Blake's silver sports car skidded to a halt near the delivery entrance. He killed the headlights. A black SUV was already waiting in the shadows. A massive man stepped out of the vehicle. It was the lead enforcer from the Ironwood Syndicate, the same man who stood on my porch hours ago. Blake scrambled out of his car. He popped the trunk and hauled the heavy canvas duffel bag out with a strained grunt. He dropped it onto the icy asphalt at the feet of the enforcer. Blake was panting heavily. His designer tuxedo was soaked in sweat and ruined by the freezing winter air. He pointed at the bag with a shaking finger. He told the enforcer there was over $5 million in pure untraceable gold bullion inside. He claimed he liquidated a private reserve to cover the debt and the penalty fees. He begged the man to take the payment and clear the ledger immediately. Blake thought he had just bought his life back. He thought he had successfully robbed his senile father-in-law. The enforcer did not smile. He did not say a word of gratitude. Criminals who handle millions of dollars in shadow transactions do not trust desperate men in expensive suits. The enforcer crouched down and unzipped the canvas bag. The dull yellow gleam of the heavy bars caught the ambient light from the alley. The enforcer reached into the duffel bag and pulled out a single heavy bar. He weighed it in his massive hands. It had the correct heft. It possessed the exact dimensions of a standard gold brick. Blake stood a few feet away, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. He urged the enforcer to load the bag into the SUV and leave before the estate security patrol drove by. The enforcer ignored him completely. He walked over to the hood of the black SUV and placed the brick flat on the metal surface. He reached into his thick overcoat and produced a small, specialized leather pouch. He unrolled it to reveal a jeweler's file and a tiny glass dropper bottle filled with nitric acid. The Ironwood Syndicate never accepted hard assets without absolute verification. I watched the screen closely. I knew exactly what was about to happen. 10 years ago, my logistics company secured a highly lucrative contract to transport stage equipment for a major Hollywood studio filming a bank heist movie in the city. The production wrapped early. The studio abandoned several crates of props in one of my secondary storage facilities to avoid transport fees. I moved those heavy crates into my subterranean vault to test the load-bearing capacity of the newly installed steel shelving. The bricks were completely worthless. They were solid tungsten blocks coated in a thin layer of metallic gold paint. They were designed to look and feel authentic on a cinematic camera. Blake grabbed them in his blind panic without checking the stamps or the serial numbers. The enforcer dragged the sharp steel file across the top of the brick. He cut a deep, aggressive groove through the shiny yellow surface. He uncapped the glass bottle and squeezed a single drop of nitric acid directly into the fresh scratch. Pure gold does not react to nitric acid. Tungsten, however, reacts violently. The liquid hit the metal and immediately began to hiss. A thick plume of green smoke erupted from the brick. The acid bubbled and sizzled, eating away the cheap paint to expose the dull gray metal underneath. The enforcer stared at the smoking chemical reaction. Blake stepped forward in pure shock. He looked down at the ruined brick. The color drained entirely from his face. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had just handed a bag of painted garbage to a man who murdered people for a living. The enforcer did not shout. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply turned around and drove his right fist directly into Blake's stomach. The punch landed with brutal, devastating force. Blake doubled over instantly. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, violent gasp. He collapsed onto his knees on the freezing asphalt. He clutched his tailored tuxedo jacket and retched onto the snow. The enforcer stood over him like a stone monument. He kicked the canvas duffel bag. The painted tungsten bars spilled out into the dirty snow. "You brought us fake gold," the enforcer growled. His voice picked up clearly on the high-definition security microphone. "You tried to pay off a $5 million blood debt with movie props." Blake gasped for oxygen. He held up a shaking hand, trying to beg for a chance to explain. He swore he did not know the gold was counterfeit. He claimed his father-in-law set him up. The enforcer grabbed Blake by the lapels of his jacket and hoisted him roughly to his feet. "The syndicate does not care about your family excuses," the enforcer stated. "You defaulted on the payment. You lied about the real estate collateral. Now you insult us with fake metal. Your time is officially up. The boss is arriving personally in exactly 1 hour. He is coming straight to your front door to crash your high society Christmas party. If you do not have $5 million in verified liquid cash waiting for him, he will take this entire estate tonight. He will take the cars. He will take the artwork. Then he will take your life." The enforcer threw Blake backward against the brick wall of the alley. The black SUV roared to life and sped away into the darkness. Blake remained slumped against the frozen brick wall for a long time. He wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. A thin stream of dark blood trickled from his split lip and stained his crisp white shirt collar. He looked at the worthless metal bars scattered across the snow. His entire world was collapsing around him in real time. He had absolutely zero leverage left. He pushed himself off the wall and stumbled blindly toward the service entrance of the mansion. He stepped into the warm, brightly lit hallway. I watched him walk past a mirror. He straightened his ruined tie and wiped the blood off his chin. He forced a rigid, terrifying smile onto his face. He walked back into his lavish living room to mingle with his elite guests as if he were still a titan of industry. He tried to maintain his wealthy facade while a ticking time bomb sat beneath his floorboards. He poured himself a tall glass of expensive whiskey and waited for his executioners to arrive. He had no idea his night was about to get infinitely worse. The emergency local news broadcast was about to go live across the state. I sat in the cab of my Ford truck watching the live security feed from Kendra's living room. The party was reaching its peak. A live jazz band played smoothly in the corner of the massive room. High society guests milled around the imported marble fireplace holding crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. Women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits laughed at shallow jokes. They celebrated wealth they had not earned. Blake stood near the center of the room. He held a fresh glass of bourbon. He tried to project the image of a relaxed host. The high-definition camera captured the deep purple bruise forming on his lower lip. He wiped a stray drop of sweat from his forehead. He checked his heavy gold watch every few seconds. He knew the Ironwood Syndicate was driving toward his front gates. He needed to figure out an escape plan, but he was trapped by his own vanity. He could not run away in front of the city elite. He had to stand there and play the role of the successful executive. He had no idea his entire performance was about to be permanently canceled. The digital clock on my tablet hit exactly 11:30 at night. The emergency broadcast protocol initiated across the state networks. The gentle jazz music playing through the mansion sound system suddenly cut off. The three massive flat-screen televisions mounted across the living room simultaneously switched from their muted holiday displays to a bright blue breaking news graphic. The sudden blaring sound of a news anchor reporting an emergency press conference silenced the entire room. The guests turned around, holding their expensive drinks in total confusion. Blake stared at the largest screen. He saw my face broadcast into his living room. I stood tall on the television screen, standing shoulder to shoulder with Mayor Marcus Thorne. I wore my sharpest charcoal suit. My posture was rigid and completely unyielding. I did not look like a frail man suffering from cognitive decline. I did not look like an easy victim waiting to be dragged into a psychiatric ward. I looked exactly like the man who built a commercial empire from the frozen mud up. The camera zoomed in on my face. I stared directly into the lens. I wanted my eyes to burn straight through the screen into Blake's arrogant soul. The mayor stepped up to the podium first. He spoke with the polished authority of a seasoned politician making history. He declared that an unprecedented charitable contribution had just been executed in the heart of the city. He announced that I had officially donated the entire Southside Warehouse District to the municipal government. The mayor explained that the $40 million property was now a protected public asset. It would be transformed into a massive youth athletic and vocational training center. The city would use my concrete foundations to teach young men and women how to build a real future. The mayor stepped aside and gave me the podium. I gripped the wooden edges of the stand. I spoke clearly and powerfully into the microphone. I told the citizens of this city that wealth is completely meaningless if it is hoarded by thieves and squandered by cowards. I explained that I laid the bricks for those warehouses 40 years ago with my own calloused hands. I refused to let my history be paved over by greedy developers or liquidated by desperate day traders. I stated that this land now belonged entirely to the working class. The transfer was officially signed, sealed, and stamped into the Federal Registry. The city owned every single square foot of the property. The deed was irreversibly locked into a public trust. No private entity could ever purchase it. No bank could ever claim it. No shadow lending syndicate could ever seize it. I spoke the words with cold, devastating finality. I built an empire to protect my family. When my family chose to betray me, I gave the empire back to the streets that raised me. The live security feed from the mansion showed the immediate fallout. The grand living room fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. Nobody whispered. Nobody took a sip of their expensive champagne. The elite guests stared at the television screens in pure shock. They were witnessing a monumental shift in regional wealth. They were also witnessing the public execution of Blake's entire financial foundation. The camera caught Blake's reaction perfectly. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet chalk. The crystal glass of bourbon slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered into 100 pieces. The amber liquid pooled around his designer shoes. He did not even flinch at the sound. He simply stared at my face on the television. His mind frantically tried to process the catastrophic reality of my words. The collateral he promised the Ironwood Syndicate no longer existed in the private sector. It belonged to the government. It was backed by the municipal police force and protected by federal law. The loan sharks could not seize a single brick of that property without declaring war on the state. Blake realized he had leveraged a phantom asset. He had nothing left to trade. He had no overseas buyer bringing $25 million in the morning. The sale was a complete fiction. He had no gold in his trunk. He had no money left to steal. He was standing in a $2 million house that he did not own, surrounded by people who would abandon him the moment the money ran out. He was completely out of time and out of luck. I leaned closer to the microphone on the television broadcast to deliver the final nail into his coffin. I formally declare on the public record that any previous sales agreements, mortgages, or collateral liens attached to the Southside Warehouse District are legally null and void, I stated. Any private loan secured using that property is officially a fraudulent transaction. The federal courts will aggressively prosecute anyone attempting to claim ownership of this municipal land. I stepped away from the podium. The news broadcast cut back to the stunned anchor in the studio. I looked down at my tablet screen. Blake was officially holding millions of dollars in highly illegal unbacked debt. He was a dead man walking in a tailored tuxedo. He stumbled backward away from the shattered glass on the marble floor. He clutched his chest as panic finally consumed him entirely. He looked toward the front windows of the mansion. The security cameras captured a line of heavy black SUVs turning onto the private street. The heavy vehicles accelerated aggressively toward the property. The Ironwood Syndicate had arrived to collect their $5 million. They were about to smash straight through the front gates. I sat in the freezing cab of my old Ford truck and stared at the glowing screen of my tablet. The high-definition security cameras mounted along the perimeter of Kendra's estate captured the arrival of Blake's final deadline. 3 massive black SUVs did not slow down as they approached the decorative wrought iron gates. They did not stop to press the intercom buzzer or wait for the private security guard to open the entrance. The lead vehicle accelerated heavily. The reinforced steel grille of the heavy truck slammed directly into the custom metalwork. The expensive gates folded inward with a violent screech of tearing steel. The heavy vehicles roared up the heated cobblestone driveway and crushed the pristine decorative snow beneath their massive tires. They skidded to a halt directly in front of the grand entrance. A dozen men stepped out into the bitter winter air. They wore heavy dark overcoats and moved with lethal military precision. They did not hide the heavy firearms holstered at their sides. These were not men who negotiated boardrooms. They were men who collected debts using blunt force trauma. I watched the lead enforcer march up the front steps. He did not bother knocking on the custom mahogany double doors. He raised his heavy combat boot and kicked the door perfectly adjacent to the lock. The deadbolt snapped instantly. The expensive wooden frame splintered into jagged pieces. The door slammed open and hit the interior drywall with a deafening crash. The Ironwood Syndicate had officially entered high society. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the people inside. They built a fortress of arrogance funded entirely by my stolen money. I simply watched the walls come down. The live feed from his grand living room showed a scene of absolute instant chaos. The smooth jazz music abruptly stopped. One of the musicians dropped his brass saxophone onto the marble floor. The heavy clatter echoed sharply over the sudden screams of the high society guests. Wealthy politicians and elite socialites scattered like frightened insects. Women in designer silk gowns abandoned their expensive champagne and ran frantically toward the kitchen corridors. Men in tailored tuxedos who spent their days boasting about corporate dominance now cowered behind velvet sofas. The illusion of safety in this exclusive gated community shattered in a matter of seconds. Blake stood completely frozen in the center of the expansive room. The broken glass of his dropped bourbon still pooled around his expensive leather shoes. The syndicate boss walked straight through the fleeing crowd. He was a massive, broad-shouldered man with cold, dead eyes. He did not look at the screaming guests. He locked his gaze entirely on my son-in-law. Blake raised his trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He tried to speak, but his throat seized with pure terror. The boss did not give him a chance to formulate another lie. He grabbed Blake by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo jacket. He lifted Blake completely off his feet and hurled him backward with brutal, devastating force. Blake flew through the air and crashed directly into the center of the massive glass coffee table. The thick, tempered glass shattered into 1,000 jagged shards under his falling weight. Blake screamed in agony. He clutched his ribs and rolled onto the marble floor. Dark blood began to soak through the back of his crisp white shirt. The wealthy guests gasped and covered their mouths in sheer horror. The arrogant day trader who promised them lucrative financial returns was now bleeding on the floor like a common street thief. I watched his flawless facade dissolve into pathetic whimpering. The syndicate boss stepped over the broken glass and stood directly over Blake. He grabbed a fistful of Blake's hair and pulled his head back. He demanded his $5 million immediately. He told Blake that his time had expired and the collection phase had officially begun. Blake gasped for air. He coughed up a speck of blood and pointed a shaking finger toward the massive television screens mounted on the wall. My face was still frozen on the paused news broadcast. Blake stammered out a frantic, pathetic excuse. He cried that his father-in-law had sabotaged the massive real estate deal. He claimed I had stolen the collateral and transferred the property to the municipal government out of pure spite. He begged the boss for one more week to liquidate other assets. The syndicate boss did not even glance at the television screens. He did not care about municipal land transfers or toxic family drama. He only cared about the mathematical reality of his ledger. He dropped Blake's head back onto the hard floor. He stated coldly that excuses do not pay interest. He turned to his heavily armed men spreading out across the living room. He gave a short, sharp hand signal. He ordered them to strip the entire estate down to the drywall. The armed men immediately began tearing priceless oil paintings off the walls. They smashed the glass display cases and shoved expensive artifacts into heavy canvas bags. Several thugs cornered the terrified high society guests against the dining room table. They demanded the keys to every single luxury vehicle parked in the driveway. They ripped diamond necklaces from the throats of the screaming socialites. They emptied the wallets of the wealthy men cowering on the floor. The systematic dismantling of Blake's stolen empire was executing with ruthless efficiency. I switched the camera view to the rear patio feed. I spotted movement near the heavy French doors. Vanessa and Glenn were attempting to crawl away through the shadows. My former wife and her refined aristocratic husband were completely abandoning their daughter to a gang of violent criminals. They slipped through the glass doors and tried to scramble across the frozen wooden deck toward the back gate. A syndicate enforcer stepping around the perimeter caught them instantly. He cut off their escape route and grabbed Glenn by the collar of his expensive camel hair coat. He shoved Glenn violently against the freezing brick wall. The enforcer noticed the heavy platinum watch shining on Glenn's wrist. He recognized the value immediately. He grabbed Glenn's arm and brutally yanked the fake Rolex off his wrist. Glenn cried out in pain as the metal clasp cut into his skin. The enforcer kicked Glenn squarely in the chest. Glenn tumbled backward down the patio steps and landed face first in the freezing, dirty snow. Vanessa screamed and scrambled down the steps to join him. They were left shivering in the dirt, stripped of their stolen dignity. I watched the cowards freeze in the dark. Suddenly, the bright flashing glare of red and blue lights washed over the security cameras. The deafening wail of federal sirens pierced the quiet winter night. Oliver had made his phone call. The trap was finally springing shut. The blinding flash of red and blue emergency lights washed over the snow-covered street. I sat in the heated cab of my Ford truck and watched the tactical teams deploy. Oliver had made his phone call exactly when I told him to. Half a dozen armored federal vehicles skidded onto the manicured lawn of the $2 million estate. Heavily armed agents poured out of the tactical vans. They wore thick Kevlar vests emblazoned with the letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They did not knock. They did not announce themselves politely. They stormed through the shattered front doors with military precision. I watched the live security feed on my tablet. The grand living room turned into a chaotic trap. The federal agents flooded the foyer with their weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights cutting through the dim party lighting. The booming voice of the lead agent ordered every single person in the house to get down on the floor. High society guests who had never faced a physical threat in their entire lives dropped to the marble tiles in pure panic. Women ruined their expensive silk dresses in the spilled bourbon and broken glass. Wealthy businessmen covered their heads and whimpered. The syndicate boss stood near the shattered coffee table. He was a ruthless predator in the criminal underworld, but he was not stupid. He knew the difference between a local police bust and a coordinated federal raid. He slowly raised his massive hands into the air. He signaled his armed enforcers to drop their weapons immediately. Heavy steel handguns clattered onto the imported floorboards. The absolute authority of the Ironwood Syndicate evaporated in a matter of seconds. The federal agents moved in and kicked the weapons away. They forced the syndicate enforcers down onto the broken glass. The federal agents secured the syndicate members with heavy plastic zip ties. The loan sharks offered zero resistance. They understood the brutal math of the criminal justice system. Blake did not possess that kind of hardened discipline. He lay bleeding on the marble floor next to the ruined coffee table. He saw the federal agents swarming his lavish living room. He saw his criminal creditors being handcuffed. Absolute primal terror finally broke his mind. He scrambled to his feet. He slipped on the spilled champagne and the blood dripping from his own chin. He ignored the federal commands to stay on the ground. He turned and sprinted toward the rear patio doors. He thought he could escape into the freezing woods behind the estate. He thought he could outrun a federal indictment. He barely made it 3 steps. A federal agent lunged forward and tackled Blake around the waist. The sheer force of the impact drove Blake hard into the hardwood floor. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, pathetic gasp. The agent pinned Blake down with a heavy knee pressed firmly between his shoulder blades. Blake thrashed wildly. He screamed that he was a wealthy executive and demanded to call his lawyers. The agent ignored his frantic entitlement. He yanked Blake's arms behind his back and snapped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The cold metallic click echoed through the silent, terrified room. The lead agent walked over and stood directly above my son-in-law. He pulled a folded arrest warrant from his tactical vest. He read the charges with a loud, booming voice. Blake was officially under arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal conspiracy. The agent recited the Miranda rights flawlessly. He informed Blake that he had the right to remain silent. Blake did not remain silent. He began to sob uncontrollably. He begged the agents to believe that he was framed. He cried that his father-in-law had manipulated the central banking system. The federal agents did not care about his desperate lies. They hauled him to his feet roughly. Blake stumbled forward. His tailored tuxedo was torn and stained with blood and dirt. The arrogant day trader who thought he could steal my empire was reduced to a crying criminal. He was dragged out the front door in total disgrace. Kendra stood shivering in the corner of the grand living room. She watched her husband being hauled away by armed federal agents. She hugged her arms tightly across her expensive designer dress. She expected the authorities to treat her like a tragic victim. She expected them to apologize for ruining her high society Christmas party. The lead investigator approached her instead. He did not offer any comfort or sympathy. He held a secondary legal document bearing a heavy federal court stamp. He looked at Kendra with total professional detachment. He informed her that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was executing an immediate asset seizure protocol on the entire property. He explained the brutal financial reality of her situation in plain English. The $2 million estate had been purchased and maintained using heavily embezzled corporate funds. Blake had systematically stolen money from my logistics company to pay the massive mortgage and the luxury property taxes. The investigator told Kendra that the house was officially classified as the physical proceeds of a major federal crime. The government was taking absolute possession of the estate right now. Kendra stared at him in blind shock. She argued violently that the house belonged to her. She screamed that she had just signed a digital equity waiver earlier tonight to protect her ownership. The investigator shook his head coldly. He told her the waiver only proved she actively conspired to hide stolen assets. He gave her exactly 10 minutes to gather a single bag of basic personal belongings. She was ordered to vacate the premises immediately. If she refused to leave, she would be arrested for interfering with a federal asset seizure. Her perfect affluent world was legally repossessed in a matter of seconds. Kendra stood paralyzed in the center of her ruined living room. The federal agents systematically ushered the terrified high society guests out the front door. The elite friends she had spent years trying to impress abandoned her without a single backward glance. They wanted nothing to do with a disgraced woman. She was completely stripped of her wealth and her fabricated dignity. She looked around at the shattered glass, the overturned furniture, and the spilled champagne. The lavish lifestyle she believed she inherently deserved was entirely vaporized. She watched through the broken front doors as federal agents forced Blake into the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle. He did not look back at her. He was only concerned with his own survival. Vanessa and Glenn had already fled into the freezing night, leaving her completely isolated. She had no husband. She had no home. She had absolutely no money left in her private accounts. Panic finally pierced her stubborn arrogance. She realized she was entirely alone in a cold, unforgiving world. She reached into the pocket of her designer dress with a trembling hand. She pulled out her cell phone. She needed a savior. She wiped the tears from her face and dialed the only man she thought she could still manipulate. I left the chaotic security feeds running on my tablet in the study. I walked down the quiet hallway of my own house. The hardwood floors were cool and solid beneath my feet. I entered the kitchen and turned on the small pendant light over the granite island. I opened the cabinet and grabbed a heavy glass. I filled it with cold tap water. I took a long, slow drink. My chest did not ache. My hands did not shake. The storm outside was raging, but the air inside my home was perfectly still. The digital clock on the stainless steel oven read 12:15 in the morning. Christmas had officially arrived. I set the glass down on the counter. The silence in the house was profound. It was the heavy, absolute quiet that follows a massive structural collapse. I had dismantled a criminal conspiracy and a toxic family dynamic in a single day. The empire was secure. My phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The harsh buzzing sound cut through the quiet room. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed Kendra. My daughter was calling me 15 minutes after midnight. She was not calling to wish me a Merry Christmas. She was calling because her entire universe had just been repossessed by the federal government. I let the phone ring 4 times. I wanted her to feel the agonizing stretch of seconds. I wanted her to realize she was no longer in control of my time or my resources. I finally reached out and picked up the device. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. I did not offer a festive greeting. I simply listened to the ragged, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. Dad, Kendra gasped. Her voice was completely broken. It was a raw, desperate sound stripped of all her usual high society arrogance. She was hyperventilating in the freezing cold. I could hear the deafening wail of federal sirens echoing loudly through her phone speaker. She asked why I was on the news. She sobbed and said she saw me on the television with the mayor. She cried that I gave away the warehouses and the property. I stood perfectly still in my kitchen. I told her I gave my property back to the city. I explained that I protected my assets from the criminals her husband brought to our doorstep. Kendra let out a loud guttural cry. She screamed that men with guns broke into her house. She told me they drove massive trucks straight through the front gates. They smashed the furniture and threatened to kill everyone. They took her diamond jewelry. She said the federal agents arrived right after them. They tackled Blake to the floor like an animal. They put him in steel handcuffs. They dragged him away into an armored vehicle. She cried that they told her she had to leave the house right now. They said the government was seizing the estate because Blake bought it with stolen corporate money. She told me she was standing in the snow without a coat. She had absolutely nothing left. She said Vanessa and Glenn ran away through the backyard and left her there alone. She begged me to help her. She pleaded with me to wire the bail money for Blake. She demanded I call my lawyers and fix the situation. She expected me to save them. She was pleading like a terrified child. She expected me to swoop in with my checkbook and erase the devastating consequences of her actions. She expected the rough-edged bricklayer to rescue the elite heiress. I took another sip of cold water. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I stated coldly that she was asking me to finance the release of a man who tried to destroy my legacy. I told her she was asking me to save a thief who stole from his own employees and gambled away her entire future. Kendra pleaded through her tears, claiming she was my only child. She demanded my protection as a father. I kept my voice entirely flat and authoritative. I told her I would not protect her from the reality she actively created. I explained that Blake embezzled $5 million from my company. I stated he forged my signature on corporate bonds. I reminded her that he routed her personal trust fund to a shadow lending syndicate to cover his massive debts. He left her completely bankrupt. I reminded her that I warned her about his financial bleeding earlier tonight. She had refused to listen. She had called Blake a visionary. She had called me a jealous old man. She eagerly signed a digital waiver giving him the last of her equity just to spite me. Kendra sobbed violently, begging me to stop talking. I did not stop. I told her she let her husband hire a corrupt doctor to forge a psychiatric evaluation. I reminded her she stood by while he declared her own father legally insane. I stated she knew he planned to send medical orderlies to my house tonight. She knew he intended to lock me inside a padded room in a psychiatric ward so he could steal my empire without interference. I told her she was going to let them strip me of my freedom and my dignity just so she could keep throwing lavish parties for people who abandoned her the second the police arrived. I said she traded my life for a $2 million house and a glass of imported champagne. Kendra cried frantically, claiming she did not know the truth. She swore she did not know the full extent of what he was doing. She said she just trusted him. She sobbed that she did not know he was going to lock me away in a facility. She claimed she did not know he was stealing from the mob. She begged me to believe her. I gripped the edge of the granite counter. I replied that ignorance is a choice. I told her she chose to look the other way because his lies funded her vanity. She chose the illusion of wealth over the father who laid bricks to build her life. She chose to be a victim of her own arrogance. I stated clearly that I would not pay a single cent for his bail. I told her I would not send my lawyers to rescue her. I reminded her she wanted independence from my toxic control. I told her she finally had it. I advised her to learn how to survive in the real world. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I cut off her frantic pleading permanently. The kitchen was completely silent again. The poisonous branches of my family tree were finally pruned. I picked up my glass and walked out of the kitchen ready to face the dawn of a new order. Weeks passed quickly and quietly. The federal justice system moves with devastating speed when handed a perfectly assembled portfolio of corporate fraud. Blake stood before a federal judge and received a 15-year sentence without the possibility of early parole. His arrogant smirk was entirely gone. He traded his bespoke Italian suits for a standard-issue prison uniform. The Ironwood Syndicate fell right alongside him. The raid at the estate provided the authorities with enough physical evidence and encrypted cell phones to indict their top leaders under federal racketeering laws. The loan sharks who thought they could intimidate me on my own front porch were now locked in maximum security cells. I did not attend the sentencing hearings. I had a logistics empire to rebuild. The courtroom spectacles were a waste of my time. I simply read the final verdicts in the morning newspaper while drinking my black coffee. The collateral damage extended perfectly to the parasites who enabled the betrayal. Vanessa and Glenn faced a brutal immediate financial reality. The fraudulent corporate credit lines were permanently severed. The luxury car dealerships repossessed the white Bentley. The bank foreclosed on their heavily mortgaged properties. They were forced to pack their remaining designer clothes into garbage bags and move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the loud industrial side of the city. Glenn had to pawn his few genuine possessions just to cover their basic grocery bills. They spent their days blaming each other for their total collapse. I did not shed a single tear for any of them. They built a fragile house of cards based entirely on my stolen labor. A slight breeze of truth was all it took to blow their fake aristocratic lives completely away. I watched the dust settle and focused my attention on the future. Kendra faced the harshest awakening of them all. The federal government seized every single asset she owned. The banks drained her accounts to recover the stolen trust funds Blake had wired to the syndicate. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. She tried to reach out to her wealthy socialite friends for a loan. They blocked her number immediately. High society despises a public scandal. Stripped of her $2 million estate and her imported champagne, she was forced to enter the real world. She rented a tiny studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. She had no college degree and zero actual work experience. She spent weeks filling out applications until she finally secured a minimum wage job as a receptionist at a busy dental clinic. The girl who used to complain about the temperature of her heated driveway now had to wake up at 5 in the morning. She had to put on a cheap polyester uniform and walk 6 blocks through the freezing snow to catch the city bus. She sat shoulder to shoulder with the working-class people she used to mock. She spent 8 hours a day answering phones, dealing with angry patients, and cleaning up the waiting room. She learned what it feels like to have your feet ache at the end of a long shift. She learned how to calculate the exact cost of groceries before putting them in her basket. She experienced the grueling physical and mental exhaustion I endured when I was laying bricks in my 20s. I drove past her bus stop one evening in my Ford truck. I parked across the street and watched her step off the crowded transit line. She looked exhausted. She carried a cheap plastic grocery bag. Her shoulders were slumped under the weight of her new reality. I did not honk the horn. I did not offer her a ride. Rescuing her now would only destroy the vital lesson she was finally learning. The arrogance had been burned out of her. The entitlement was gone. She was finally learning the actual value of a hard-earned dollar. She was learning that respect is not something you inherit. It is something you build with your own 2 hands. I put the truck in gear and drove away, leaving her to finish her walk home in the cold. I returned to my corner office at the top floor of Hayes Commercial the very next morning. The building felt different. The toxic ambition Blake had infected my company with was completely scrubbed clean. I sat behind my heavy oak desk and immediately initiated a massive corporate restructuring. I purged every single executive who had turned a blind eye to Blake's embezzlement. I replaced them with the men and women who actually understood the logistics business. I promoted loyal warehouse managers and veteran drivers to senior administrative positions. I rewarded the people who possessed actual calluses on their hands. Oliver and I worked directly with the federal banking authorities to unfreeze the corporate accounts. We fully restored the employee pension fund. I personally guaranteed every single dollar of their retirement savings with my own private capital. I walked out onto the dispatch floor and looked my workers in the eye. I promised them their futures were bulletproof. Later that afternoon, I drove down to the Southside Warehouse District. The rusted iron gates were wide open. City construction crews were already busy clearing the old asphalt. The environmental injunction was officially lifted for municipal development. I stood in the bitter cold and watched the massive excavators break ground on the new Youth Athletic and Vocational Center. The mayor had kept his promise. The blueprints displayed state-of-the-art basketball courts, boxing rings, and industrial training workshops. I watched the heavy machinery dig into the frozen earth. I felt a profound swelling of pride in my chest. I was not leaving behind a hollow fortune for ungrateful heirs to squander. I was leaving behind a fortress of opportunity for the next generation of fighters. My true legacy was finally set in stone. I walked back to my original 1980 Ford work truck. The heavy steel door closed with a solid, comforting thud. I turned the key and the old engine roared to life with steady, reliable power. I drove away from the construction site and navigated the quiet streets back toward my home. I parked in my heated garage and walked into my empty house. The silence inside was no longer a sign of isolation. It was a sign of absolute peace. I am Javon Wright. I am 70 years old and my mind is as sharp as a razor. My real estate empire is completely bulletproof. My enemies are locked in cages of their own making. I poured myself a glass of cold water and leaned against the granite kitchen island. I survived a heart attack and I survived the ultimate betrayal. I learned that you cannot buy loyalty and you cannot negotiate with greed. When people mistake your kindness for weakness, you do not need to scream or throw tantrums to prove them wrong. True power does not shout. It does not demand attention or beg for validation. True power simply observes, the board calculates the risks, and adjusts silently. I took a slow drink of water. The war was over. I had won. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much